In 1939, the United States Army ranked 18th in the world, not 8th, 18th, behind Romania. 600,000 soldiers against Germany's 4 million. Hitler looked at those numbers and laughed, calling America a mongrel nation of shopkeepers who'd never stomach a real fight. 5 years later, that same country was building a 4-engine bomber every 63 minutes and launching a warship every single day. So how did the nation the Germans mocked become the machine that buried them? It started with one catastrophic miscalculation. To the German high command, America was a curiosity. Jazz and Hollywood, refrigerators and Coca-Cola. Skyscrapers, yes. Ford motor cars, sure, but warriors, not a chance. Hitler admired America's size and loved its films, yet dismissed it as a society of plutocrats who'd never bleed for anything. In 1939, the numbers backed him up. Why fear the 18th best army on earth? Because contempt has a cost. One by one, every senior German officer would arrive at the same conclusion. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a factory, and the factory could not be beaten. Some figured it out early. Others needed to see American fighters over Berlin. But they all got there. It began with the single worst decision of the war. December 11, 1941. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Japan has just attacked the United States, and the world is waiting to see what Hitler will do. He's under no obligation to act. The Tripartite Pact was defensive, and Japan struck first, so Germany owes nothing. For 2 years, he's ordered his U-boat captains to avoid American ships, careful not to wake the giant across the Atlantic. Then he walks into the Reichstag and declares war on the United States, voluntarily, unprovoked. At 3:30 that afternoon, his foreign minister reads the declaration to the American chargé d'affaires, and the chamber erupts in applause. Historians would call it Hitler's single greatest mistake, and that's saying something for a man who invaded Russia in winter. Consider the timing. His armies had just stalled 5 miles from the Kremlin, freezing in the snow, already fighting the largest land war in history. And he chose that moment to also take on the largest industrial economy on Earth, because he believed the American factories were a bluff. A country that made more movies than machine guns could never tool up fast enough to matter. The war, he was sure, would be over before Detroit learned to build a tank. He was wrong, and the speed of it is one of the most astonishing stories of the 20th century. In 1941, America built 3 million automobiles. The country worshipped the car. Then Pearl Harbor hit, and the entire auto industry didn't slow down. It shut down. For the rest of the war, more than 3 years, the United States built exactly 139 civilian cars. Total. The most car-obsessed nation on Earth simply stopped and started making everything else. And the scale of everything else is hard to believe. Take Willow Run, a single Ford building in Michigan. 3.5 million square feet under one roof. It was so vast that a straight assembly line would have crossed into the next county and triggered a second set of taxes. So Ford's engineers bent the line 90 degrees twice and called the bends the tax turns. The building was literally too big for the local tax code. Inside, 42,000 workers ran the line around the clock. The noise was deafening. Rivet guns hammering, machinery grinding, metal screaming against metal. The air was cutting oil and hot steel and human sweat. And along the walls, 1,300 cots sat in rows where flight crews slept in shifts, waiting. Because every 63 minutes, a brand new B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine bomber with 1.5 million parts, rolled off the end. Pre-war Ford car had 15,000 parts. This bomber had 100 times that. And Willow Run built more than 8,600 of them, peaking at up to 650 a month. Put plainly, Germany could not shoot down B-24s as fast as one factory could build them. And Willow Run was just one factory. In the shipyards, Henry Kaiser took the 197 days it once took to build a Liberty cargo ship and cut it to about 2 weeks. Then, to prove a point, his workers assembled the SS Robert E. Peary, 250,000 parts. In 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, it floated, it sailed, it served, Chrysler got an order to build tanks before its factory even had walls. So engineers parked a steam locomotive inside the half-built shell to keep workers from freezing through the Michigan winter, and built tanks anyway. With no proper tank engine on hand, they welded 5 car engines into a single 30-cylinder monster. It worked, powering Sherman tanks off a line that existed before the building around it did. 350,000 workers poured into Detroit in 18 months. Women in headscarves took their places on the rivet lines. The city smelled like sparks and sweat and purpose. But steel pouring out of Michigan was only half the story. The other half, the part that turned German confidence into something closer to dread, didn't happen on a factory floor at all. It happened the moment all of this reached the men at the front. Here's what you have to understand about the German military in 1942. Man for man, they may have been the finest fighting force on the continent. Superbly trained, brilliantly led, and none of it mattered anymore. The war had stopped being about soldiers. It had become a war of supply. Rommel understood this before most. In North Africa, his Africa Corps fought with desperate brilliance, outmaneuvering larger forces and earning him the name the Desert Fox. By the old rules of war, his men should have held their own against anyone. But the old rules no longer applied, because his men were starving. Their meat ration had dropped to 200 grams a week. A few slices. Fuel was vanishing. Every worn tire and overheated engine was a loss that might never be replaced, because German supply ships were going down in the Mediterranean. Then Rommel's troops overran an American supply dump, and what they found stopped them cold. Not a modest depot, a warehouse stacked to the ceiling. Dense American canned meat, instead of thin gristle real coffee, gasoline in drums to the horizon, cigarettes, medical supplies. Everything his quartermasters had been begging Berlin for. His half-starved soldiers stood in that warehouse and understood what their leaders still wouldn't. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a supply chain with no bottom. Rommel put it in a single line. The battle is decided by the quartermasters before the shooting begins. He learned it the hard way, staring at American abundance while his own men went hungry. And it wasn't just Africa. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers noticed. The trucks in captured Soviet positions weren't Russian. They were American Studebakers, shipped across the Pacific. The canned meat was Spam from Minnesota, served to Soviet riflemen, 1,000 miles from the nearest American port. They called it Lend-Lease, and the Germans could taste it in the rations they pulled off the Soviet dead. By war's end, American industry had produced roughly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment, 2 of every 3 weapons, vehicles, and machines the entire Allied side used. Tallies read like a fever dream. About 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks. Allied armored vehicles and trucks totaled around 4.3 million. The Axis combined managed 670,000. Allied ships, nearly 55,000. Axis, 1,670. These weren't competitive numbers. They were numbers from 2 different wars, and that's what made it unbearable at the front. Destroy an American tank, and tomorrow there were 2 more. Shoot down a bomber, and by dinner another had rolled off the line at Willow Run. Ambush a convoy, and within a week every truck, rifle, and ration had been replaced, as if the ambush never happened. Your victories evaporated. Your losses were permanent. Theirs weren't. No amount of courage or tactical genius beats an enemy who simply cannot run out. Germany had one last hope. For a brief window in 1942, U-boats were sinking Allied ships in the Atlantic faster than they could be replaced. Strangle the supply lines before all that steel crossed the ocean, and maybe the factories wouldn't matter. Then Kaiser's shipyards hit their stride, and America began building ships faster than Germany could sink them. The window slammed shut, and the last argument for German victory died in the cold Atlantic. Even Stalin knew where the power was. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, he raised a glass, not to the Red Army, not to Soviet courage, but to American production, without which this war would have been lost. Coming from the man whose soldiers did most of the dying, that toast says everything. Remember Hitler's boast from 1940? An American intervention by mass deliveries of planes and war materials will not change the outcome of the war. That line didn't age badly. It aged catastrophically. Because by the spring of 1944, America was delivering something Germany thought impossible. And it arrived, over Berlin on a Tuesday in March. March 6, 1944. The sirens wail over the capital. Nothing new. British bombers had hit Berlin by night for months. But today the bombs fall in daylight, and escorting them, hunting German interceptors, are single-seat fighters, American P-51 Mustangs. A single-engine fighter isn't supposed to have the range to fly from England, Berlin, and back. The fuel, the weight, the distance make it a near impossibility. Yet there they are, hundreds of them, filling the sky over the heart of the Reich. Hermann Göring had personally promised Hitler that no enemy bomb would ever fall on German soil. When the reports reached him, he gave what became one of the war's most famous lines. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." 6 words. The sound of a man who knows the argument is over. Göring wasn't the only one doing the math. Hitler's armaments minister had pulled off what people called a production miracle, squeezing more tanks and planes out of German factories. Even as Allied bombs fell on the roofs, the output was real, and Speer knew it was meaningless. American GDP had nearly doubled during the war. The United States alone built around 310,000 aircraft in 4 years. There was exactly 1 year, 1941, when the conquest-swollen German Reich's economy may have edged past America's. After that, the gap became an order of magnitude. Speer could read the spreadsheet, so he fed Hitler misleading numbers, painting a rosy picture while privately watching the avalanche win. By late 1944, American fighters outnumbered the Luftwaffe 6-1, sometimes 8-1. The German aces who'd survived 4 years of combat were dead, replaced by teenagers with a few weeks of training, sent up into a sky that belonged to someone else. The drone of massed American engines became the soundtrack of German defeat. There's a famous story about a German general who knew the war was lost the moment he captured an American chocolate cake from a downed plane. Historians call it folklore, but the legend survives because the documented truth is even stranger, and it played out not on a battlefield, but in prison camps on American soil. More than 370,000 German POWs were shipped to the United States, many of them Rommels, desert fighters, sent to the very country they'd been told couldn't fight. They expected the worst. Starvation, beatings, forced labor. What they found left them speechless. It started on the transport ships, where they were fed the same rations as American GIs, soft white bread instead of hard rye, real coffee instead of the grain substitute they'd drunk for years, meat and butter and sugar. At the camps in Texas, Kansas, Florida, and California, the abundance only grew. Ice cream, Coca-Cola, Hershey bars, coffee, sugar, and real chocolate, rationed or vanished inside the Reich, were unlimited behind American barbed wire. German prisoners were eating better in captivity than free German citizens were eating at home. Some POWs picking citrus in Florida and California were given unlimited oranges, a fruit many hadn't seen in years. And here's the detail that captures the entire war in a single image. Some of these men, their digestive systems, hardened by years of deprivation, actually reacted badly to the rich, high-fat American food. Their stomachs couldn't handle the abundance. They were made physically sick, not by cruelty, not by hardship, but by sheer plenty. They were made sick by abundance. These were professional soldiers who'd marched across Europe, certain they represented the greatest civilization on earth, now picking oranges in the mongrel nation of weaklings. The food, the trucks, the highways, the careless wealth of workers eating beef sandwiches on a lunch break, all of it screamed one unbearable truth. Their leaders had been wrong about everything. Many would later say the abundance changed how they understood the war forever. It was never about bravery or tactics. It was a ledger, and every line of it ran against them. So what became of the men at the center of this story? Rommel, the one who understood quartermasters before anyone. never saw the end. In October 1944, linked to a plot against Hitler, he was forced to take poison. In exchange for dying quietly, his family was spared, and he got a state funeral. He was 52. Franz Halder, architect of the invasion of Russia, was sacked the moment his honest assessments became inconvenient. Adolf Galland, the ace shot down 4 times, survived, lived to 1996, and carried Göring's verdict on the Mustangs to the world. And Albert Speer, the man who knew and hid it, escaped the noose at Nuremberg, served 20 years, and spent the rest of his life selling the myth of the good Nazi who didn't know. He'd always known. The numbers had told him everything. This is what happens when the most powerful military in Europe picks a fight with the most powerful economy on Earth. When contempt blinds you to math. The men who mocked America as a nation of shopkeepers ended up in its camps, eating its food, picking its oranges. Some emigrated there after the war, back to the country that beat them, not with better soldiers, but with better factories. William Knudsen, the GM President Roosevelt drafted to run war production, said it best. "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen, nor dreamed possible." And aircraft maker Donald Douglas added the coda, "Free men can outproduce slaves." That one stings harder when you remember Speer's miracle, ran in large part on forced labor, and still lost. Your fathers and grandfathers didn't just fight a war. They outworked one. The riveters, the welders, the women on the lines at Willow Run. They never fired a shot, and most of them are gone now. But every bomber that buried the Reich began in their hands. That's the part the monuments tend to forget.